Welcome to Boost CYAC's webinar series. This is Ellen Yack, and I'm hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, I'd like to review a few housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, please click on Floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the power presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on Documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right. There will be a question and answer period during the last 5 minutes of the webinar. To submit your question, please go to the toolbar on the right and click on Messaging and then Participants and type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time, but they'll be addressed at the last 5 minutes. If you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. Housekeeping point on my end, I've prepared slides for you with additional information that I won't be covering or reviewing during the PowerPoint presentation, the webinar this afternoon. So they're there for your perusal at a later date. So today we're talking about sensory motor tools and strategies to support mental health clinicians. My objectives are for you to understand the impact of sensory and motor tools and those strategies on mental health, to identify types of sensory input that calm and alert the nervous system. And I want you to gain knowledge of the sensory motor tools and strategies that can be integrated into your clinical practices and home programs. Just to give you a bit of background, the use of sensory motor tools within mental health practice has a long history, but gained recognition in 1998 through some of the work of Patricia Deegan. She's an individual who was involved in developing the recovery movement. She herself has schizophrenia, and she talked about the importance of looking at integrating sensory motor tools into daily life to help support and minimize some of the experiences she had. This is a quote of hers. In terms of the recovery movement, self-directed process of healing and transformation that often includes the use of sensory modalities to calm, organize, and prevent negative responses to crises. Patricia Deegan reports that in the course of doing the trauma work, I sought out the help of an OT who specialized in sensory defensiveness in adults. For those of you who weren't with us last week, sensory defensiveness is when an individual overreacts to sensory input, whether it's touch or sound or smell, and they have a fight-fright response to it. It's not just that they're oversensitive to it, but the sensory input triggers a protective defensive response leading to a fright, fight, or flees response. So Patricia Deegan is saying that she sought out the help of an OT who specialized in sensory defensiveness in adults, and she helped me to learn a myriad of coping strategies, including use of a sand blanket, which is a weighted blanket, joint compression, tactile brushing, and the use of a sensory diet to help me modulate sensory input and effective arousal. These strategies have proved tremendously helpful and are part of my everyday recovery toolkit. So many of those strategies that she mentioned in this quote we'll be reviewing today, and I hope will become part of your toolkit. Development in service provision, particularly with individuals with a trauma history, is a program called SMART, and it stands for Sensory Motor Arousal Regulation Treatment. And it provides a bottom-up approach to treatment of complex trauma. Bessel van der Kolk, who, as you all know, is one of the gurus in terms of working with trauma. His clinic is in Boston. An occupational therapist by the name of Jane Kumar had a private clinic. She's since died a couple of years ago. She had a private OT clinic in Boston that Bessel van der Kolk was aware of. He asked Jane Kumar to come to his clinic to consult and provide some sensory motor tools for their clients because they were finding it difficult to meet with clients and work on therapy when their clients were really anxious and dysregulated. So Jane Kumar came in, made some recommendations, designed some sensory rooms, and out of her involvement at their clinic, psychologists and social workers uh, met with her and developed this program and this book and a training program that's available for mental health clinicians. So initially, it began as a model to manage arousal regulation, but it really evolved into a more structured model to treat trauma and attachment disorders. And as I said earlier, it was a collaboration between psychology, OT, and social work. And when you look at the program they recommend, it really is a combination of attachment theory and treatment, sensory motor psychotherapy, and sensory integration theory and practice. What I'm going to be focusing on today is the sensory integration practice area and provide you with practical tools that you can incorporate into this type of treatment. There was also the development of sensory motor psychotherapy, and that directly treats the effects of trauma on the body, which facilitates emotional and cognitive processing, and that integrates sensory motor processing with emotional and cognitive processing. Um, so that was also a development in the mental health field. And many of the components, when you look at how they're integrating the sensory integration concepts, are based on the SMART concepts. And the assumption is that trauma happens when a developmental context disrupting, within a developmental context, disrupting normal sensory, motor, emotional, social, and cognitive development. So any intervention, because it's impacting all areas of development, needs to focus on ensuring appropriate sensory motor development. Um, the other assumption is trauma experiences are held within the body, and again, that's the assumption in sensory motor psychotherapy, and disrupts the arousal regulation system. Arousal regulation is a prerequisite for effective processing of trauma. So again, intervention, arousal regulation must be addressed during trauma treatment. And to address arousal regulation, you need to be aware of sensory motor input and how it impacts arousal regulation. And of course, your CBT is also an intervention that is part of the SMART concept. Just to alert you to other areas within mental health that focus on sensory motor tools. Lillis and Turner in 2009 wrote this book on infant, child, and mental health and early intervention. And their focus looks at the significant impact of sensory processing and self-regulation on mental health. It recognizes the complexity of mental health problems and need for interdisciplinary practice, and it focuses on involving both a bottom-up approach and a top-down. So the bottom-up approach is looking at sensory motor tools to support arousal regulation, and of course the top-down approaches are more talk therapy, CBT, and others. Just to identify some research related to this area of combining sensory motor tools within mental health practice, a 2010 study noted that SI treatment, so sensory integration, treatment based on sensory integration theory, combined with psychotherapy, significantly improved outcome measures compared with psychotherapy alone. So this was a really important study. A study in 2010 looked at mothers and their 12 to 18-month-olds with atypical sensory processing, and children in who had OT SI approach, so significant improvement more quickly, and the ones who showed more improvement in the parent-child interaction and dyadic play than just who received mental health support alone. And what they specifically noted was mothers were reading the child's social cues better, and there were longer communication sequences or longer periods of engagement, and likely because of more normalized arousal regulation. Before we go into those treatment techniques and sensory motor tools and strategies, I just want to alert you to the various methods of assessment when we're looking at sensory processing. So there are various standardized measures, and there's a sensory profile developed by O.T. Winnie Dunn. And that's also one available for adults and adolescents, and it has been recently updated. So there's a second version, and there is also a sensory processing measure. More and more standardized questionnaires are being developed. The questionnaires, there's some concern with the questionnaires because it's just based on parent reporting. So there were attempts to develop a sensory scale where you could actually administer standardized input, standardized ways to provide sensory input, like tickling the back of the neck with a feather, uh, uh, certain sounds, and observing the reaction. And there was a standardized measure to look at the intensity of the reaction. Those kinds of investigations are certainly very, very difficult to get standardized. And those efforts really haven't taken off. It's more that we've been looking at those standardized parent questionnaires. There are tests that can be done in a lab setting, and the challenge protocol was developed by OTs and used in research lab settings where actually electrodes are put in the eyes and haptic response monitors are put on the hands, and ECGs are taking place, and they're looking at evoked potentials in response to different types of sensory input, and those have shown significant differences. Actually, a study showed a significant difference between someone who has sensory defensiveness and someone who has attention deficit disorder because their presentation can be very similar. And what they found on EEGs is that the response to sensory input lasted a lot longer in those individuals with sensory defensiveness compared to the individuals with attention deficit disorder. And what that means is, and we know individuals with ADHD are often distracted and orient to various non-relevant sensory input in the environment. And that those tests, that research supported that, but it also supported the comments on people with sensory defensiveness is that their orientation and the response to that input lasts longer. So many individuals with sensory defensiveness, if they hear, the school bell ringing or a siren going off in the street, they say they can hear it for a long period of time, even when it's no longer present. And that research supported that reaction. And just to alert you to, there were tests developed by OT Jean Ayres that looked at sensory integration functions and were more than just questionnaires. There's a variety of sensory preference checklists. So this is different than a questionnaire looking at a typical sensory processing. Sensory checklists look at what input individuals prefer. Tina Champagne, and you have that in your reference list, is an OT who works in adult mental health settings. And you'll see her book, and in her book, she's got these preference lists that are easily reproducible, and she gives you consent to reproduce them. And it's important to use if you're going to look at introducing some sensory motor tools for calming, because not everybody's calmed by the same sensory motor type of input. So some of us like to take a warm bath. Some of us like to have candles, but others don't like any kind of smell, even if it's supposed to be a calming smell. So it's useful to look at sensory preferences. And remember, these checklists for preferences is not looking at atypical processing. So it's not looking at overreactivity or underreactivity. They're just looking at things that you find calming. There's Moore also, and you have her reference, provides a list of sensory preferences. And Williams and Schellenberger in their alert program for self-regulation also has a sensory preference checklist for children and adults. Providing an environmental assessment is also important because we have to understand the sensory factors in the environment that can affect behavior. And sensory factors can also function as setting events or antecedent conditions or sensory reinforcers. So you all know that certain environments for someone who has a trauma history can trigger um, very negative experiences. So part of our role in working with these individuals is really thinking about doing an environmental assessment to prevent those sensory factors that can trigger those experiences. Before I talk about the tools that you can integrate in your practice, I'm going to go over specific OT interventions that we use and we might be recommending to clients you might be working with. The Wilbarger Thayer Pressure Protocol is a protocol that was developed by Patricia Wilbarger, and it's designed to reduce sensory defensiveness. And it basically is provision of deep pressure massage with a surgical brush, followed by joint compressions. When the goal is to reduce sensory defensiveness over time, this procedure, the massage followed by joint compression, is initially recommended to be introduced every 120 minutes. There's no research on the long-term benefits. There's certainly clinical reports, but short-term research has showed reduced cortisol following application of the technique. So they looked at cortisol levels in the saliva before and after brushing, and they found it was reduced. So some people don't just use the Wilbarger protocol to reduce sensory defensiveness, they use it as a calming strategy. So they use it for its short-term function of producing a sense of calm. And it's very similar to a massage. Deep massage, any kind of deep pressure to muscles, joints, tendons, and ligaments provides neurotransmitters, dopamine, for example, to the brain that has a calming effect. So Wilbarger Thayer pressure, where you're using a brush um, to massage the skin, followed by joint compressions, might be something recommended to mental health clinicians. Though it really is important that you be trained by an OT or anyone who's had training in the Wilbarger, because you really have to use significant heavy pressure on the brush, and a lot of individuals use too light pressure, and light pressure can be alerting to the nervous system. Beanbag tapping is another tool that occupational therapists will recommend. And again, the beanbag tapping doesn't have a long-term goal like the Wilbarger protocol, where you're doing it every 90 to 120 minutes over a period of weeks regularly. Beanbag tapping is used for the short-term input and short-term goal of reducing anxiety, reducing arousal, increasing attention to task. And again, and beanbag tapping is a lot easier to administer than the Wilbarger brushing. So when you have a latency age child, a teenager, an adult, it's much easier to teach them how to do the beanbag tapping than the brushing. The brushing is harder to do on yourself because you have to exert so much pressure. So beanbag tapping, again, provides deep pressure touch input to the body. Helps provide a feeling of alert calmness and increased body awareness. The taps also need to be firm enough to reach deep pressure receptors, and the light tapping can be irritating and not calming. And the beanbag tapping is preferably offered is self-administered, because not only are you getting calming input from the tapping, but you're getting calming input because you're doing it rhythmically. I didn't bring a beanbag down here, so I'm going to use this. But really and I hopefully, Raul, can you tell me if my arm's in the picture? Because I don't see a picture of myself.
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
So you want to hold a beanbag in your hand. And you can make it. You can get a sock and fill it with rice, and then tie off the bottom of the sock. So you hold the area of the sock with the rice in your hand, and you repetitively and rhythmically tap your arm, and you go over the head. It doesn't really matter. You can do it 10 times in one spot and then slowly move up the arm. To the shoulders and back down again. And you really want it to be rhythmic. So for young children, the song I use is, I just forgot the song. The ants go marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. The ants go marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. And you slowly move up the arm, and you want to keep it rhythmic. So if you're anything arrhythmic, and we're going to talk about the nature of sensory input, But rhythmic input, any type of rhythmic input, is more calming and organizing to the nervous system, and arrhythmic is alerting to the nervous system. And you'll find many individuals who have high levels of anxiety really have difficulty doing anything rhythmically because their muscles are so tight. So beanbag tapping is a very useful strategy. I have lots of adults at their workplaces who have beanbags in their drawers, and who either tap at their desks or go to the washroom. Um, and do the beanbag tapping, and they find it's very calming and organizing to the nervous system. For those individuals, I myself am under responsive to input from my tactile and my proprioceptive systems, so I have very poor body awareness. And beanbag tapping also increases the awareness of where your body is in space. And those people who experience dissociation, and again, in your sensory motor psychotherapy approaches, when you're working on that and you want to get them to feel where their body is, use of beanbag tapping can be very helpful. And again, we typically do arms, and you can also do, the tops of legs. We avoid neck, and obviously, and stomach and chest, but beanbag tapping is for arms and legs. Taps should be firm, but not hurt. Um, and as I said, you work up to the shoulders. You can tap the back if it's in reach. And as I said, never tap neck, chest, face, or stomach. Um, OT intervention often combines the sensory diet or these sensory motor tools with cognitive behavioral strategies. And now there's formal programs in place, the alert program for self-regulation. Again, if you're working with children, that is a really good program to use and explore sensory motor tools to support arousal regulation. We also integrate sensory motor tools with a 5-point incredible scale. Um, for those of you who aren't, we'll for those of you who aren't familiar with the 5-point incredible scale, one is you're feeling calm, two, you're starting to feel a little bit agitated, three, you're agitated, four, you're really agitated, five, you can't stand being in your skin. So it's a progressive scale. And we might integrate, when you're starting to feel like you're at a three, maybe it's time to do beanbag tapping. So we're looking at proactive sensory motor tools before they get to a level five. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the zones of regulation, because that's being more commonly used now. Um, in the Toronto Board of Education and Simcoe Board of Education, it's been identified as a curriculum that needs to be introduced in JK and SK. And there's some other provinces and cities in other provinces, but I don't have their names right now, where they're introducing the zones of regulation in the kindergarten system. Some boards introduce, and some teachers introduce it better than others, but it is being introduced. And the zones target self-regulation and emotional control using a CBT approach with the emphasis on sensory supports. And it creates a system to categorize how the body feels using 4 colored zones. And there's recognition that everyone moves between all 4 zones. So it's not the hierarchy like 5-point incredible scale, because you recognize you can go to the red zone, and 5-point incredible scale, you don't want to go there. So these are just some pictures of those programs. In the alert program for self-regulation, how does your engine run? They relate the body and arousal to a vehicle. And they look at, and if you want to integrate it with the zones, the green zone is when the body's just right, the engine's running just right. The blue zone is when the engine's running too low, and the yellow and red zones might be when the engine's running too high. And again, for young children, there's other ways that you can help them identify these different engine speeds. And again, looking to see what the individual is interested in. An associate used Winnie the Pooh characters, Eeyore being too low, Tigger being too high. I'm not sure about Winnie being just right. I think he's a little bit low. I think Owl is probably just right. And here's a pictorial of the 5-point incredible scale. And again, just using facial features to demonstrate emotions. Um, I can't show you this video, but it's here to remind me to give you an example of how this boy Liam used the 5-point incredible scale. Liam is a 10-year-old with high functioning autism or Asperger's when that term was used. He had a high level of anxiety. He had a lot of difficulty in the classroom. He had a lot of difficulty, particularly at recess. He really demanded a lot of structure in his environment. He was one of these kids who had difficulty if other children weren't following the rules. He had difficulty with things were out of place. His anxiety would escalate throughout the day, and often in response to certain events at school, he'd become aggressive. The 5-point incredible scale was introduced, and he created Liam Land. He was very creative and very imaginative, and he was able to identify the progression from 1 to 5 by being on a beach and looking at the weather. Again, uh, many individuals with Asperger's have an obsessive focus on certain interests, and weather was an interest of Liam's. And for him, it uh, made sense for him to think about being on a beach on a sunny day, feeling very, very happy, being with his family, no cares in the world. And then number 2, a few clouds started to roll in. Number 3, more clouds started rolling in. 4, it was starting to thunderstorm. Um, Everybody had to get off the beach quickly. Everybody was running. And 5, it was like continuing bolts of lightning and continuous claps of thunder, and people had to duck for cover. And it was really a concrete way for him to identify the dysregulation that he experienced. That's just an example of how you can adapt these programs to individual children and adults. These are some just pictorials of the zones of regulation. Again, I'm not going to go through each of them in terms of describing the zones, but just um, the red zone, although we tend to want to avoid being in the red zone, there is recognition that sometimes you have to be in the red zone. If there's a fire drill and fire alarm and you have to get out of somewhere quickly, you have to really respond quickly. There's also recognition that it's okay to be in the yellow zone, that sometimes it's really okay to be silly and wiggly and really, really excited. Um, so there's more of a focus on moving and transitioning between these zones. And in the zones program, they offer, it's like the sensory preference list, they offer tools memory, tools menu to look at different sensory motor tools that can support arousal and emotion regulation. And there's all sorts of reproducible tools in the zones program to support getting the children to understand what angry or mad looks like, what frustrated looks like, what do they look like when they're calm or happy, what do they look like when they're tired or sad. And when they're feeling that way, what are some tools to use? So we're always looking as clinicians not to have to reinvent the wheel and develop our own worksheets. So this resource has a lot of very usable worksheets for all of us. For younger children, it's useful to talk about a toolbox, and that sometimes resonates for children. You can also talk about how your zones change throughout the day. So I just wanted to familiarize you with those cognitive behavioral programs that integrate sensory motor tools. So sensory diet is something that OTs have talked a lot about for the last 30 years. The term was coined by actually Patricia Wilbarger. Some OTs in some programs have moved away from using that term because sometimes it can be misunderstood. The term is used to describe a combination of activities and environmental accommodations that meet an individual's sensory, emotional, and or behavioral needs. All of us in our daily lives as individuals, as parents, as partners, will use a combination of sensory motor activities or tools and environmental combinations to meet our own needs and the emotional and behavioral needs of our partners, of our children. when a child wakes up, and a baby wakes up in the middle of the night, and you're going in to soothe them, and if you're not doing sleep training or ferberizing them, you go in the middle of the night. You don't turn on the lights. You don't pick up the baby and start singing. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. You typically keep the lights off. You may or may not pick up the baby. You're going to use a quiet, soothing, rhythmic voice. If you're picking up the baby, you might know that they like bouncing input. You might know that they like rhythmic back and forth movement. You might know they like bouncing plus patting their bums. You might know that they do well with shushing sounds, or they do well with a soft lullaby. So you are choosing a combination of sensory motor activities and input and environmental accommodations to meet the needs of that baby. The concept of the sensory diet has gained recognition, certainly over the last more than 40 years of my practice. Because when we would recommend sensory motor tools or accommodations in the environment, um, you know, people would look like at us as if we're crazy. This is a slide that's in Google Office, head office. And again, if I'm looking at that slide, to me, it's alerting. It's going to provide quick movement. And the turns of the slide, it's changing directions. And we know change in direction is alerting to the nervous system in terms of movement. So perhaps people in that office setting will choose to use that slide when they're starting to fall asleep at their desk. This is also in Google Office. They have swings. And the swings aren't just used for break or for calming, because rhythmic, repetitive movement also helps organize the nervous system and focus attention on a task. So some individuals might use this swing um, during their day if they're losing focus on their task. In my practice, I have two psychotherapists who do work, and they find hammock chair swings very, very useful. And I recommend hammock, I can't say it, chair hammock swings to be in any mental health clinician's office. The repetitive rhythmic movement it provides is really calming and organizing. Our psychotherapists are blown away about how more productive their sessions are. And we've had a lot of individuals who have come to OT to look at their sensory motor systems and to explore sensory motor tools in our office. And we've had many children disclose their trauma history where they've been resistant to disclose it in the mental health clinician's office. So I can't impress enough. If you're looking at one piece of equipment and it's not expensive, you're going to see it a little later on. You can purchase it for $19.99 when Canadian Tire has a sale. I think it's a little bit more now on Amazon, but this is one of my most recommended pieces of equipment to have in a mental health clinician's office, as well as to have in someone's home when someone has an anxiety disorder. And again, here it's just part of popular, it's in Google offices. Standing treadmill desks have become more popular. So the concept of looking at a sensory diet or looking at sensory experiences to calm, alert, or organize the nervous system has really gained recognition. And there are sensory experiences that are more calming and organizing. So it inhibits arousal reactivity. It can inhibit overreactivity to sensory input. So someone with a trauma history who might be hypervigilant in their environment, and you want to inhibit or decrease the registration of sensory experiences when they have to be in a setting which has sensory input that they're uncomfortable with, you might look at offsetting that by providing a sensory diet or providing input that has deep pressure, neutral warmth, slow rhythmic movement. Again, movement in a single plane. Remember I talked about the slide when it changes direction. It's more alerting. Slow vibration is calming, soft music, which we know, and we know a lot of this. Mammals, by the way, instinctively rhythmically rock their infants for calming. So there's some instinctual recognition that we have in terms of offering the type of sensory input. that individuals need. Neutral colors, minimal contrast between colors, subtle smells, and there's some specific smells that are more calming than others. And again, familiar or predictable input is more calming and inhibitory. Any new input can alert the nervous system. Okay, so we have to spend more attention um, to and orient to unfamiliar input than familiar input. So you want to really think about maybe not changing up what's in your office all the time. Or if you are changing what's in your office, giving people predictability and so they're aware that it's going to change. But introducing new things all the time might be too alerting for individuals. Alerting or excitatory experiences, so those are for individuals, who have mood disorders, who are depressed, who have very low affect, low energy. Might be, may or may not, again, it has to be individually evaluated, but might be appropriate for individuals who have issues with disassociation. So light intermittent touch is alerting. Fast or arrhythmic movement in multi-planes, loud or rhythmic music. Unpredictable light and sounds, citrus, cinnamon, peppermint, rose tastes, bright contrasting colors. And here's where, when you want to alert the nervous system, you want to provide unfamiliar or unpredictable input. So before I talk about Alex, we, again, when I said we use sensory strategies to help with our own arousal regulation, think about, for those of you who are watching this webinar at work, in the Toronto area, there's a bad snowstorm outside. Think about when you're in the car and you're having to drive a long distance in a snowstorm. Some of you might be very anxious, so you might stay in a high state of arousal, and you might be getting too anxious. Chew gum. I recommend for anybody teaching their teenagers how to drive, chew 3 pieces of gum. Pressure input to the jaw. The jaw has a lot of proprioceptors. Pressure input to the jaw, again, releases calming, the dopamine. Chewing is repetitive and rhythmic and is a really good tool to reduce anxiety. So I often recommend gum chewing, not just for clients, but also for clinicians, either before a session or during a session, when so many of us have to change our own arousal levels and we have to settle ourselves a little bit. Or if you're working with challenging clients, not just the client or the parent or another provider, but you need to, in terms of therapeutic use of self, you're focusing on co-regulation. Chewing gum or sucking on a spouted water bottle might be a good tool for you. I can't show this, but this is just a clip of a dramatic change of a young boy who is really, really under aroused, and he sucked on a popsicle and he became really aroused. Organizing sensory experiences are very similar to calming ones, and any kind of heavy lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling, any weight-bearing activity, climbing activities, any midline activities are calming. So a really good activity for adolescents and older adults is a kettlebell that I'll show you later that provides midline activities, and chewing and blowing on anything because it's midline and it brings your eyes centered. Can be organizing. I'm not going to go through each of these slides. It gives examples of different types of sensation that are calming and organizing. So I'd like you to peruse that on your own. Visual sensations. And here, remember, I told you certain smells are more calming and certain smells are more alerting. Just a comment. Olfactory input can be really intense, as we talked about last week, in terms of being directly going to the limbic system. So you really have to be cautious with use of smells. Smells, as we talked about last time, can trigger traumatic events. If you are using smells, often essential oils are better. They have a longer lasting effect than just alcohol-based perfumes. Um, they can be very supportive in sessions, but you really, even someone who, even though you know that lavender might be calming, for some individuals, there's a percentage of people who can't stand the lavender smell. So accept this as a generalization, and you really have to peruse it further with individual clients. So when you're looking at sensory diet considerations, obviously you need to understand the individuals of your clients. You need to look at sensory preferences. And Take, for example, a weighted blanket. We know that weight, deep pressure input to the body can be significantly calming. But individuals who have a trauma history, individuals who are confined in some way, anxious individuals, even without a trauma history, sometimes the weight of a blanket or the compression of a compression sheet is too confining and they can't tolerate being confined. And for many of us who don't have that history or don't have anxiety, if when I can see the whole group I'm speaking to, um, there's usually about 25% of the group who can't stand the feel of sheets tucked into their mattresses. They can't stand that feeling of confinement, and they have to make their sheets sure their sheets are untucked. So there's different preferences we all have. So we really have to be important, note that. We have to look at the institutional support different agency has in terms of implementing sensory motor tools. So whether you're working with a client who's in a school setting or a vocation work setting, you have to look at what support there is. You have to look at the available environment and equipment available. You have to look at time and scheduling constraints. So, something like beanbag tapping can be done quickly. It doesn't take a lot of time out of a student's or a worker's day. And you also have to look at the other staff and client needs. So, for example, bouncing on a ball chair in the middle of a large open space office might not be appropriate if other staff members get dizzy by looking at the bouncing of that ball. A sensory diet can be implemented through a formal schedule of activities. They can be embedded into daily routines. You can structure the environment. You can structure interactions, and you can structure leisure activities. And this is a way to introduce sensory tools in a classroom setting or a vocational setting, just getting a bin and having small tools that an individual can work with. I just wanted to give you these sites where they have accommodations for people who have clothing issues. And we're going to look at some various environmental accommodations. Lava lamps with its rolling rhythmic movement can be common for individuals. This is in the home of adult with autism who I do workshops with, and he has lava lamps and he finds that that helps in his environment. There are light filters that can cover bright fluorescent lighting that can be purchased for those individuals who have hypersensitivity to light. We used to just cut old tennis balls, but you can get chair socks now at Staples for individuals. Say if you're working with a teacher who can't stand the sound of all their kids' chairs scraping on the floor, there's ball socks available. There's white noise machines available and blackout masks. Hammocks and any kind of swing really is very, very useful to have. And some people use that as a bed. This is an individual on a hammock swing with a weighted blanket. In different clinic settings and school settings, I've recommended a tent. This is in a ABA program for children with autism, and they have a tent. And in that tent, there's a lot of weighted products. For children and adults who seek a lot of movement input, you can create movement corners. This is, other than the brown inflatable pillow, this was created by old mattresses. A crash pad, for individuals who like a lot of proprioceptive or deep pressure input and always are crashing into the couch. I have a lot of adults who like weight training programs or CrossFit programs. There's a lot of jumping down. There's a lot of crashing into things. This is I'm getting old and having word retrieval problems. This is a duvet cover, and we've just put in pieces of foam. You can get pieces of foam from upholstery companies, and that can create a crash pad. Ball chairs have been used for a long time, and that was probably the first moving chair option we had. I find for a classroom setting or a work setting, ball chairs can be too distracting, and you also have to have good abs to be on the ball chair. And for some kids, they can get too silly on it. Here's an example of sitting on a ball chair. I prefer hockey stools. where you can sit on the stool and you can get a little bit of movement. Your upper body is still, and they're not distracting to other students or workers. Here's an example of a classroom sitting on the hockey stool. There's all sorts of smaller move and sit cushions that people put on chairs. I don't find them that helpful because you don't get as much movement. This is a pedal pusher that you can put underneath the chair for kids who and adults who have very restless legs, and they can bounce on it with their feet. A cheaper version, because that's about $100, a cheaper version is to use hot water bottles under the feet. And again, and it provides, people who are really, really restless and need a lot of movement of the legs. There are a variety of different types of weighted products: blankets, vests, hats, neck collars, lap pads, wrist and ankle weights that I'm going to talk about. Um, we'd like to have more weighted blanket research than we have. Again, any kind of research into sensory motor input is very difficult to do following rigorous methodology because of the difficulty getting homogeneous subjects um, and using control groups. But we do have some research. Um, this study, and again, I'm not going to go through the study, but it did show that there was a significant decrease in anxiety use. And this was a study with adults, and they used a 30-pound weight. Before I continue with weighted blankets, I need to alert you to a controversy that certainly many people in Canada are aware of. Not a controversy, but an issue that arose in Canada. In Quebec, about 10 years ago, a child died in a weighted blanket. And unfortunately, the weighted blanket was used incorrectly, and the weighted blanket was used as a punishment. And a small child was in a weighted blanket that was significantly too heavy for him, and he was rolled into it, and his face was covered. So it was used as a punishment, and his face was covered, and he suffocated. So there are school boards across Canada, and there's mental health agencies across Canada who have real restrictions about the use of weighted blankets and specific guidelines in place. Some guidelines might include a doctor's order. For adults, it really can't be used with people who have moderate to severe circulatory, respiratory, or temperature regulation issues. It should never be used as a restraint or punishment. It should never be used over the head. And you need to look at weight, because different types of weight are preferred, and the type of fabric. And with adults, you're starting to look at 20 pounds and add or decrease. For young children, you're looking at 10% of body weight. Here are some examples of weighted blankets. This is a nice one because the head pops out. This is a homemade weighted blanket that was made with pockets of aquarium rocks. Aquarium rocks are used because it's easy to wash, so you don't have to take out all the weights. This is a compression sheet. I actually have a woman who was referred to me who had a bipolar diagnosis, and had a lot of difficulty settling down at bedtime. And she put this sheet on a guest room bed, and she would read in the guest room. And when she was relaxed, she went to sleep with her husband. That compression sheet is available through laceandfabric.com, and also compression sheets are now available through Amazon. There's various types of weighted vests. When looking at weighted vest guidelines, 50% of adult body weight. There's been no studies done in adult use. Studies in children have noted increase in attention, and there's positive anecdotal reports in the ASD literature. Here are some examples of weighted vests. This is a compression vest. This is a weightlifting garment that just provides compression around the middle. These are snug vests. This is a very expensive vest. It's about $400, and the individual can pump up the amount of compression they want. Miracle or sensory belts. I've used these with children and adults, and it's useful because it can be worn throughout the day under a shirt, over or under a shirt. There's weighted neck collars or lap pads. Weighted hats for individuals who really like the feeling. And again, those individuals with dissociation, those of us who have poor body awareness, having a weighted hat on our head really tells us where we are in space. TheraBand is a really useful piece of equipment because anything repetitive, rhythmic, or provides resistance is calming. So for adults in the work setting, I often recommend a small piece of TheraBand that they can pull on. I also love TheraBand for TheraBand breathing. So the concept of just sitting and doing deep breathing is difficult for many of our children and our anxious adults because their body needs to move. So you pull out on the TheraBand to inhale and release to exhale. So this is just bicycle tubing that can also be used. Having access to spouted water bottles because sucking is repetitive and rhythmic is calming to the nervous system, or sucking on a straw. I talked about chewing gum already. There's all sorts of what's called chewable toys. So individuals who chew on their clothing, chew on their hands. There's chewable bracelets. There's chewable necklaces. There's some that look a little bit more mature. So these, I have some adults who wear this around their arm, and it's also very similar to, many adults will put hair elastics that they can pull on and fidget with, but that you can purchase these and they're a little bit more stiff than um, hair elastics. Pencil chewers. So for the individuals who are chewing through their pencils and you're concerned about getting the lead, these are chewy pencil toppers. And again, for some individuals who can't chew gum because they swallow it or they don't like the taste, pencil toppers might be an option. This is just another example of a chewing device that, again, this is used for real oral motor seekers who need intense input because it's a harder surface to chew on. We talked about aromatherapy. Fidget toys. Fidget toys have gotten a bit of a bad name after the fidget spinners came out. Because fidget spinners need a lot of it, it alerted the nervous system because you were looking at the visual input. But fidget toys can be very useful for both movement seekers as well as those who are anxious. And I did a workshop for Boost staff a couple years ago, and we talked about getting a pencil case or that plastic um, container that I showed earlier to put in some tools that the clinicians who do court prep and go with clients to court to testify. One of the things I'd like you to come out of this meeting with is to look at how you can create those toolkits with whether it's a fidget toy, whether it's aromatherapy, whether it's having packages of gum. But those toolkits can be really critical in helping support those individuals, not just going into court prep, but perhaps if they're having to be in a meeting with someone that they're very stressed about, whether they have to confront somebody, individuals who you're doing family therapy with, and just being among family members causes a lot of stress. I hope you have my voice in your head and you start thinking about what toolkits we can put together to support these individuals. I talked earlier about the kettlebell. Weighted balls sometimes are useful. A grip strengthener. Again, this is something that I have at adults' desks to work on and use. For adolescents and adults, a can crusher, you can get it at a hardware store. And again, provides a lot of resistance input to muscles and joints. And those individuals who really don't see a function of weightlifting, it's very concrete. You see the can crushing and it's reinforcing. So sometimes this will be an activity of choice. This is how you use the kettlebell. To provide movement input to children, there's something called the Billy Bow. You can get it on Amazon. And again, if you're working with children and they come into your office and they really need to blow off steam, this is, I think, $35 and can store really easily. These are bigger saucers. This is a spinning toy from IKEA. These are more tools that we'll put in a home. A scooter board, again, is more of a tool that we'll use in the home for children who are movement seekers. This is this is indoor equipment by Limmy Kids. And again, this is something we might recommend for real movement seekers in the home to provide extra input. These are ways we've been able to put swings in the home. There's different stands. This is a swing in an ABA program. There are swing supports that can be put in the door frame. use of an inner tube as a swing, and here's the hammock chair that I talked about that I think every mental health setting should have. And if you can't put it in the ceiling, you can get a hammock chair with a stand. These are other examples of swing chairs. Again, a swing in the middle of a living room. And for really anxious kids and adults, more I'm having them put these kinds of swings in their home. Yogi Bo is a crash, sort of a more substantial beanbag chair that hugs the body. This is a ghost that it provides. It's called a ghost, but it provides a lot of input to the body. Though having a treadmill, again, we all know the benefits of exercise, walking to school with a weighted knapsack, having a small pedal exerciser or a portable stepping machine. And I just want to comment uh, in Spark, the Revolutionary New Science of Exercise, if you're interested in the impact of exercise and stress on aggression, again, I'm not going to go through these slides, but it really is a really important book. If you're a clinician who really recommends exercise a lot, I strongly recommend you look at this book because it provides you with a lot of supports for that recommendation that you can share with your client. And John Ratty's, line is exercise is like taking a little bit of Prozac or Alderol. Um, there are specific sensory motor supports that you're seeing more and more in mental health settings, and the Tina Champagne book and the Karen Moore books that I have in your references list and talk about what people do to create a sensory room. There's sensory gardens in mental health settings. There's also sensory carts and can go to different floors that have all these sensory motor tools that I've talked about. And the purpose of a sensory room is to allow for exploration of self-regulatory strategies, offer stuff to de-escalate when in crisis, provides an environment to explore those tools and attachment strategies with parents potentially, and can also help foster a relationship between the child and the clinician. Here are just some examples. Again, I'm not going to go over them, but that can be included in a sensory room. And before I finish, we're good timing. We've got time for questions. But before I go to questions, Tina Champagne is an OT in Massachusetts, and she was hired by an institution for adults. And they had just had an accreditation, and they were going to lose their accreditation because they had such high rates of restraints. And she introduced sensory rooms, and she introduced a sensory cart. And when they went back for accreditation, there was a very significant drop in frequency of restraints. And because of the work in this specific mental health institution, her program was administered in mental health institutions across the Massachusetts area. Okay, so I'm going to get back to, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to get back here, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go to questions. And then the last few minutes I can take. I will see. The question is, can you get copies of the pictures I shared? It's a very large file to send through email, and I will speak with Boost and the Kudo people. I'm very happy to share those slides. They can tell me the mechanism, how to use, how to send it, and I'm happy to, I'll send those pictures. I would love to share those pictures with you. I was asked, who was it in Massachusetts? Her name is Tina Champagne, and there's a reference list for her book in your references, and she talks about the tools, the sensory carts and sensory rooms. She talks a lot about weighted blankets, so that's a good reference for you. You might have already said, will we get copies of both PowerPoints? You need to Pearl from Boost should let you know. She just said the posted, they're downloaded that you can do. Okay, so they're in the Docs tab right now. And let me see if I have time. So again, that they told you about. And Pearl can comment on where the reference list is. She sent it out in an email. And I think I've gone through. Okay, they're gonna. Okay, so some are just ask procedural stuff. Okay. Oh. Okay, I think I've gone through them. Thank you so much. I hope you have um, my voice in your brain. I hope you'll remember some of the tools we talked about, and I hope it's really enhanced your practice. Thanks for your attention and enjoy the rest of your day.